Today I shall deliver something much needed. It is a picture of ordinary life in late medieval England. Unlike the rank generalizations that have permeated the 20th and 21st century zeitgeists, this will be a genuine attempt to understand the past and its people in their correct contexts and on their own terms. This will cover both the lowest and the highest in the great chain of being, along with all those who fell between. All of these interacting with one another and engaged in a multi-layered world of social bonds and obligations. Although the social structure of late medieval England was undeniably and indelibly hierarchical, this did not necessarily equate to the totalizing restriction and repression of everyday life that most often imagined today. A specific breakdown of the social order will be the subject of my next piece, but in short, what is now termed the peasantry was a much broader classification with much variance in experiences. Less than half of the peasantry, as we know it, were serfs, or villeins as they were called then, and this number fell dramatically from the 13th and 14th centuries onwards. Quite simply, these were people who worked the land for their survival and their sustenance. Not too far off were husbandmen and yeomen who owned their own land and even sold their surplus to produce at market. This was not a completely new phenomenon, but it was becoming far more widespread and common. More will be said on this next time, but needless to say, to envisage ordinary life in late medieval England, this must be understood, but we must also understand that life was fundamentally rural and local. Way over 90% of people in England lived in the countryside. These were small settlements of hamlets and villages, built up and adapted to meet material, social and spiritual wants and needs. And when served right, these covered the basic requirements and facets of human life. Dr. Adrian Green aptly summarized the simplicity of this, writing, "Human cultures generally revolve around food, clothing, shelter, work and worship." Now this isn't such a bad combination. This was reflected in late medieval England with the widespread cultivation, production, consumption of food, clothing and other essential goods carried out in largely independent households with their own hierarchies and sovereignty. This was the general purpose and routine of ordinary people's lives. Crucially, this was supplemented by proximity to others, doing very similar things, meeting in public places, like the alehouse secularly, or the church spiritually. Again, the church, locally, as well as on the national scale, was the largest proponent of education, instruction, charity in their world. There were many social functions of the parish church that I have explored previously, but these are often overlooked when compared to its evident and innate spiritual role. R.W. Southern captured this succinctly, writing, "The annals of village life were short, yet no more substantial work was accomplished in our period than the building up of a village life, which, though full of hardships and shortages, was not without dignity, colour, and the independence which comes from a well-established routine." When we dig deeper, we see the roots of this world in the household, which was the centrepiece of everyday life. People were born here, they lived here, and they died here. Though subsistence agrarian lifestyles are unknown to most modern people, myself included, what we do now call the nuclear family was seen in this period. Households were made up of a husband at the head, a wife at his side, their children, possibly extended family, especially the elderly, and sometimes those outside the family, such as apprentices or those in service supporting the household as well. It was a real team effort, each role utilizing the natural strengths of its members, when served correctly. The majority of the populace lived off the land, sustaining themselves through their toil and labour. On a basic level, the ordinary persons worked for their survival and subsistence, with the household ultimately working together to ensure the cultivation, production and consumption of food and other essential goods and clothing. The open hall was at the centre of these essential undertakings. This room was the bedrock of life in late medieval England. It is where they were warmed by a central hearth, where cooking or the production of other essential goods was conducted. The time spent outside working in the fields or rearing livestock was processed and materialized in this part of the home. The men, namely the husband slash father, at the head with their sons and other boys bound in their households, did the bulk of work outside the house. Though it should be noted that there were exceptions, either in times of dire need or with specific seasonal tasks that were to be carried out by women. Food and goods were sourced and produced through the crops or natural materials raised from their own lands or their lord's land. Otherwise, they may have come through other local means acquired through the exchange of commodities and services, far more often than through commerce and coin. To us, this work may seem endless, but it's important to remember that 1/3 of all days in the year were not worked, with days that the lands could not be worked for weather or for crop cycles, and because of saints' days and holy days being observed. The purpose of this work was well understood. It was to provide the necessities for sustenance and survival. It was clearly seen to those pulling crops out of the ground, tending to an animal that would provide meats for many months, or with a view of their home in the distance. Men and women also worked in the house, in the hall, or in service blocks dedicated to turning these crops and materials, meats, into life-sustaining goods. Women were instrumental in the preparation and production of foodstuffs, using well-practiced techniques like pickling, brining, and the salting of meats to ensure food could last for durations needed. These activities were vital in the survival and sustenance of the house. Other activities like spinning wool and cloth to make garments, the dominance of slow-cooked meats like stews, roasted meats, pies, attests to the numerous activities that one would have to be engaged in near constant presence of someone in this house. Childcare would be dealt with by mothers, but it would be delegated possibly to other siblings as well. People learnt about their world and learnt the skills they needed to navigate it in the home and through the examples and support of their elders. This was the essential life cycle of the medieval world. There was a significant degree of variation of this depending on affluence and social standing. When looking at the masses, first and foremost the focus was on meeting sustenance and survival needs, just as I've outlined above. But as time went on, it became increasingly common to produce surplus, to trade or sell at market, providing a circulation of additional and possibly luxury goods or materials and financial security. The home and the house features widely in the surviving literature of the period, as far back as Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Though these depict chivalric and gentlemanly subjects, this was the ideal set and disseminated all the way from royalty to nobility to gentry and further down. Lower in the social order, these stories were still popular. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Piers Plowman and Robin Hood ballads all conveyed similar themes. Here the house was both a functional and a symbolic space. The hall was seen across all levels of society, in houses humble and grand, maintained later on for its symbolic representation of order and hierarchy. Back to the household. Once these essential goods had been first sourced, then produced, then stored, they would now be consumed. The household was naturally fed in the home, often in the same hall where the processes that led up to the meal being plated had been undertaken. This lifestyle lacked many of the comforts that we're now accustomed to. For instance, heating was limited. As a result, rooms were often simple and multifunctional, even crude by modern standards. Many people would have slept in the same rooms as they work and ate in, even sharing beds. To do it justice, though, I'm depicting their lives at its simplest form, that of a peasant, whether a lowly serf or tenant, and maybe going up the social order to husbandman and yeoman. We must consider those in the past, as they saw the world, unlike the tendency that is now far too common to denigrate what was seen then. This was recognised also by Orwell in A Road to Wigan Pier. He wrote that most attacks upon the Middle Ages, and the past generally, by apologists of modernity, are besides the point, because their essential trick is to project modern man with his squeamishness and his high standards for comfort into an age when such things were unheard of. When looking fairly at the past, you can see the antecedent aspects of our life now. We did not invent these comforts out of nowhere. They were established through centuries of work and adaptation to human needs. Many would have had separate kitchens, specialized rooms like butteries, pantries, also parlours, solas and chambers. This would be especially common for yeomen and those upwards in the social order, something that again became more prevalent as time went on and will be addressed in due course. Anyway, I digress. This will all be dealt with next time and in the future, when we explore the social structure of late medieval England and how this played out in people's lives and shifted as time went on in this world that was living, that was dynamic and that was ever changing.